So one thing that I struggle to discuss with new clients is the concept of bracing. And I think the reason I struggle with that is it's a very internal process. It's all to do with how we hold air in the body and the pressure we create. And it's to do with the tension we create with our muscles as well, the way that we kind of contract certain muscles to put our joints in the best position and to take up any slack. And all of that happens inside the body. And we know that generally, when we think about cues for our exercises, it does tend to work best if we think about external cues, such as pushing the floor away on a deadlift or trying to hold something between the shoulder blades on a back exercise like a row or something like that. So to the untrained eye, bracing leaves very few visible clues, and it can be very hard if you're kind of watching a video of yourself. It can be very hard to understand if you're doing that right. And I think that makes that quite tricky. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what happens during bracing and why it's beneficial for our lifts. So when we perform one of our big lifts, like a squat or a deadlift or a bench press, we're often transferring weight from the lower body up into the upper body. Whether that's because we're connected to the bar or because the bar is on our shoulders or we're pushing, there's always that transfer of force. And the way that force is transferred is through the midsection of the body. And when I say that, I'm referring to the spine and the area that we often know as the core or the trunk around the kind of abdomen and torso area. And if we're not rigid through that area, then that can cause us to collapse and fold through the back, which obviously, we can tolerate. We shouldn't be petrified of rounding through the back, but it is something that may cause us to lose our form and fail the lift. This is where bracing comes in. Because it reinforces that area with pressure and tension, it can put you in a stronger position, which obviously can improve your success with your lifts and improve the amount of force you're able to put into the bar when you're going for a big lift. So for this analogy, this straw is going to represent my spine. And it's important to remember we can bend the spine, it's not going to explode, and it's important to train the muscles of the back through a range of motion. But when we do these bigger lifts, we do want the spine area to be as rigid as possible to assist with that transfer of force. So although it can bend, when we do our lift, we want it to be straight. If we're squatting or deadlifting, we want it to stay in the same position and be rigid. So right now I can bend this however I want because there's no reinforcement, okay? And it's purely the strength of the straw that resists me bending it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a piece of this off to represent our spine, typically like our lower back area. That's one for you. I'm going to put it inside this balloon, which is going to represent our core area. So at the moment, the spine is inside this core area, but because there's no air in there, there's no pressure in there, I can still bend that however I want. If I fill that area with air, so now this is full of air and it's full of pressure, I can't even get to the spine area to bend it. I can just about touch it, but because there's so much pressure on the outside, I can't bend that spine. So that's a kind of representation of what happens when we brace. We've got so much pressure, so much rigidity in this area that I now can't make any movement in the spine, or it's much harder to release. So this is useful for talking about the breathing pattern and the way we build up air pressure during bracing. It's not very useful for describing the way that we build up tension for our lifts in the muscles, especially the muscles that surround the back. This looks slightly different for each movement, and I'll put up some videos so you can get an example of that. But the good news is you can generally do both at the same time. So as you tense up your back to prepare for a deadlift, you can fill your stomach with air at the same time and create that tension in the back and that pressure in the front, in the stomach area, and that can be very useful. For most exercises, you can kind of time those together as you set up for each rep. It's important to remember that you want to keep that brace for the whole time you're doing your rep. So even if you're at the bottom of a squat or something like that. But when you're in a rested position, either at the very top of a movement or when the bar is resting on the floor, then you can reset and take as many breaths as you need before you start again. Unfortunately, this is part of what makes paused exercises so horrible, is that if you're pausing at the bottom of a movement to build time under tension there, you're holding your breath the whole time. And that can be very uncomfortable, especially after you've done a few reps. But luckily, having that opportunity at the easy part of a lift to be able to restore your bracing is a good way to gain back any tension you might have lost. I always find front squats a good example of this. By the time I get to the bottom of my front squat, my elbows would have dropped slightly. So when I get to the top again and I reset my breathing, I can also lift my elbows up again, and that gives me the best tension for going into my next rep. So hopefully that helps your understanding of bracing. I always like to think of it as making sure your tyres are well inflated before you go on a car journey. you need to make sure you've got the right kind of pressure there in order to keep yourself on the road. Remember that good bracing will always leave clues. You might start to feel a lot of pressure in your body. You might start to feel kind of red-faced where you're kind of holding that tension in. It shouldn't be a comfortable position unless you're super mobile. When you're getting ready to lift, you will feel a bit of discomfort as you kind of wedge yourself into whatever kind of tight position you need to be in for your lift.